Stay tuned for Butler on Business, coming up next on the Liberty Express.
Welcome back to Butler on Business, and on the phone with me now, and Jimbo, at least, on the phone with both of us now, is a big red fella out there in Nebraska, Joe Herring. Now, I first met Joe and introduced y'all to Joe last month when we were talking about the purposeful flooding of the American heartland. Joe is a frequent contributor to AmericanThinker.com. He writes on a wide range of subjects. Today, I wanted to talk to Joe about an article he did most recently on the 17th Amendment. Joe, how you doing?
Doing well, Alan. Happy to be back.
Well, Joe, we've touched on the old 17th Amendment, but not nearly as well as you did. Tell our listeners about the 17th Amendment, what the harm that it has done, why old Wilson peddled it to begin with, and how we could benefit by getting rid of it.
Well, the 17th Amendment, for those who aren't already aware, is what changed the initial or the original intent of the Constitution from senators being elected by the legislatures of their individual states and switched it over to being elected by the people of their respective states. The ramifications of this are endless. In fact, it's what in essence it's created is a alliance between the executive branch and the legislative branch against the states. See, originally in the Constitution, senators were to be the representatives of the governments of their states, not of the people of their states. The House members were for that. Then the idea or the thinking that the Founding Fathers had was the House of Representatives would take up the people's interest. The senators would take up the state's interests in matters before the federal government. It was an integral part of the checks and balances that were to keep the federal government in line versus the states. You know, we are sovereign states. It is the United States of America, and that was the intent. Now, when this was all switched over, you ended up creating essentially you have two houses of Congress now both doing the same job and not doing it very well. You know, the upper chamber does not stand between the federal government and the state treasuries any longer. It's now a participant in the looting of those treasuries. You know, you can trace back all of the unfunded mandates that come from the federal government that are bankrupting states and all the way down to municipalities, all stem from the ability to team up the legislative and executive branches on the federal side against the interests of the states. In other words, they pass the agenda in Washington and then tell the states to figure out how to fund it.
Well, one thing that comes to mind and one state that comes to mind is Obamacare and Ben Nelson.
Unfortunately, you know, wherever I go, you know that, and here's another interesting tie-in. The guy who championed the idea and ushered the 17th Amendment through the process was our Senator George Norris from Nebraska. So, I mean, all in all, you know, we got a pretty poor track record of those guys. You know what I fear the most as we look at the present debt ceiling talks is that right now the federal government dictates exactly what happens when and where through the means of taxation and monetary policy. Previously, when senators represented their state legislatures, their state governments, they could stand up and put a halt to those types of things. They could say, wait a minute, you're requiring these sovereign states to do something, yet you're not providing any funding for it. You're not giving any constitutional basis for it. We won't go for it. And they could stop that. You'll look, if you look at a graph of the growth of the federal government prior to 1912, when this amendment was ratified, and then look at the growth afterwards, it's almost a straight shot up. And it's because it removed one of the last major bulwarks against the overreach of the federal government.
Now, I'm familiar with the amendment. I'm not really familiar with the drama surrounding it. Was this something that Wilson concocted, or did this actually come from progressives of that era?
It was from progressives of that era overall. You know, the idea, there were some abuses at the time that fed the fuel for this. For example, many of the senators from each of these different legislatures, many of them were bought and paid for. There was no doubt about it. You know, the large moneyed interests in those states made sure that they got their man in. Well, no one can argue that that was bad, but compare it to what we have today. There's no way that anyone can tell me with a straight face that the system we have today is less corrupt. You know, at least back then, you could trace the money back to the individual. You could see who was bought. Now the money flows from so many different sources through, you know, not just state alone, but from throughout the entire country. One person or even an organization can't follow it all. The accountability is gone. You know, the reasons for the amendment have all largely been bypassed and changed over the years. It's really it's kind of a dead issue amendment, but to challenge it is to challenge the election of the senators by the people, and that's an issue that's easily demagogued.
Yeah, Joe, you point out in your article that the Senate has really become a millionaires club. I think to run for the Senate today, you're going to have to spend anywhere from $6 million to $60 million to get elected, and under the prior system, they would just choose the person, like you're saying, that would represent the state the best. They didn't have to be a multimillionaire. You know, how does that play in?
Well, it changes the dynamic entirely. You know, imagine this scenario. Let's say we went back to we repealed the 17th and went back to the original way of doing things. Now, a senator or a senator-to-be would have to go lobby his own state legislature, which is a much smaller group of people. He would lobby his own executive there to be sent to the upper house. He would then be beholden to who? He would be beholden to the state and the legislature, and he would represent their interests against the federal government, which would sever that symbiotic link between the unions, the method of union endorsing candidate who then gives a sweetheart deal to the union as a thank you, who then supports him next time. You know, that would be the sever to that symbiotic link that has bankrupted us and led us to the fight we're having in Washington right now. You know, you can't touch a Senate race without millions of dollars in your war chest. You can't be in the Senate without being an extremely wealthy person. It's the most exclusive club in the world at this point. And each year we spend, somewhere in the neighborhood of close to $1 billion on Senate elections alone each time that we do this, each cycle. I meant to say not each year.
Oh, and what's amazing, too, Joe, is that if we were under the prior system, the Republicans would be in control of the Senate right now, and it would be a different dynamic up there.
Well, and that's exactly my point. You know, we can make a few changes that structurally that will have impact, 30, 40, 50 years down the road, as well as an immediate impact. You know, there's a big movement now to, for states' rights under the 10th Amendment. Well, the protectors of that, the people who were intended to wield the 10th Amendment, were the senators. Well, now they're just part of the federal cabal that raids the state treasuries. A push to repeal that amendment would change everything. It would be a huge step towards reining the federal government, putting it back into the constitutional constraints that were originally designed for it, which, of course, would solve an awful lot of the money problems.
Joe, one thing I would think without this 17th Amendment right now, like dead on arrival, the majority of Americans want to stop this spending. And because of the 17th Amendment, these guys, they band together and vote as a party, not in the best interest of the states. if these were all, appointed by the state legislatures as our founders intended, we wouldn't have had this split on all this legislation right now. And you can think of the New Deal, the Great Society. None of that crap would have made it through the system.
Exactly, because all of those things rely upon looting the state treasuries without the states going along with it. See, that's the beauty of that system, the way it was originally designed. The Senate would team up with the House and enact the people's, because generally the people and the interests of the individual states align. However, the Senate and the federal government don't always align at all. And the Senate was designed to be that ultimate deliberative body that would take a look at the passions that are generated in the House, take a look at the cerebral efforts that are put out and initiatives put out by the executive, and they were supposed to be the one that said, okay, how is this actually going to work in the individual states? And if it was unworkable, it went no further. And that's exactly what we need now. If our federal government were even remotely constrained by the Constitution, it would be awash in money right now. Most of what we spend are on completely extra-constitutional activities, things that should have been done at either the state or local level, or things which government should not be involved in at all. Repeal the 17th Amendment, and you'll bring the states back in to this conversation. Right now, they're just shut out. They have absolutely no voice in Washington whatsoever.
Joe, how do we go about getting our listeners involved in repealing the 17th Amendment?
Well, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. Number one is start talking to your representatives. Call your senator's office. Tell them that you want to see representation changed. They're going to give you some resistance. And the reason why you'll get resistance from there is because that changes their dynamic. They may not be supported by their own state legislatures. So if you really want to get to the bottom of it, go down to your state house. Go camp in the legislative aides offices and start convincing them to get someone to push for it on the state side. When you get 2, 3, 4 states banding together to push this repeal, you can get it then into the House. The House can then pass the resolution and send it to the Senate. Now you've got the conversation started. So it's got to start at the state level. I'll be writing more on the subject on my website. There will be future articles coming out too. But if you look at the Rand Paul is an advocate of returning the Senate back to the states. So there will be ample opportunity in the future to dig in deeper. But to do something today, just start at your state house. Tell them what you want, and that's where you're going to find your most amenable audience.
Joe, it looks like between nullification and elimination of the 17th Amendment, I think the people who are fed up with Washington, our agenda now should be to focus on the states and use the techniques that the Founding Fathers put in place for us to control the growth of the federal government.
Exactly. They were extremely wise men. They predicted all of this. They warned us about every single thing that's happening today. They did it through the Federalist Papers and through their letters. All we got to do is read it. There's no reinvention necessary.
Joe, thanks again. We look forward to the next time. Go Big Red. I hope y'all tear up the Big Ten.
Well, we plan on it.
All
Thanks,
right.
Alan.
This is Alan Butler, Butler on Business, and we'll be back in a few minutes.
No